Hello, you're listening to Leveraging Thought Leadership. I'm your host, Bill Sherman. Thought leadership often requires a delicate balance. How do you tell leaders not only what they want to know, but also what they need to know? To explore that question with me today, I invited Luke Collins. Luke is the global editor in chief and managing director at EY. He's responsible for global thought leadership at EY, which is a strategic role that requires a deep understanding of both EY's internal experts within the organization and the global leaders they're trying to reach through thought leadership. Luke's been in thought leadership roles for many years. Prior to joining EY, he served as the managing director and director of publishing at Deloitte Insights and the executive editor of McKinsey Publishing. In this episode, I'm eager to ask Luke about the strategy he uses to reach his target audiences. I also want to talk to him about storytelling and leveraging channels and assets wisely. Ready? Let's begin. So, welcome to the show, Luke.
Thanks, man. Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Now, many people define thought leadership in different ways. You've been responsible for curating content for many years. How do you define thought leadership?
My definition changes every day of the week almost. Fundamentally, I still think of it as a way of helping leaders solve their toughest problems. I think that the kind of problems that we address with thought leadership always reminds me of, Barack Obama used to say that all the easy problems get solved before they ever get to him. He has to deal with the tough ones. I sort of think of really distinctive thought leadership as being offering solutions to the kind of problems that are, for most leaders, kind of intractable. They're looking for solutions, they're looking for answers, and they just don't have them. And then, good thought leadership comes in and provides either a direct answer or a framework for how they should be thinking through how they can solve their problems.
Right. And you've been really speaking to the top of the house at large organizations for a long period of time. And as you said, the problems that are worthy of their time, effort, focus, energy aren't the easy ones. So
No.
You talked about thought leadership being at an inflection point. What do you see as that inflection point?
So, this sort of gets to the nature of thought leadership itself. When I started at McKinsey, it sort of sounds weird, but it almost felt like a cottage industry, thought leadership. It's kind of like people were doing it. It was a kind of odd term to begin with for someone who was a trained journalist and came from that world. And there weren't that many people I felt that were doing it in a systematic, sort of methodical way. And then a lot of the thought leadership also, to get to that point around intractable problems, it really seemed like the most thought leadership was geared towards strategy issues. There were lots of sort of nebulous issues that there weren't easy answers to. You would offer frameworks for how people could think about solving them and that sort of thing. And, when people used to ask what I did for a living, it was always kind of hard to explain. I would say, well, we don't sell widgets. What we sell is what we know. And so what we are doing with thought leadership is trying to convince people to buy our ideas. Thought leadership is how we demonstrate how smart we are, why we can help you solve your toughest problems. And when I think about the inflection point, there's two things. I think firms kind of began selling widgets, if you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
We began selling a lot of off-the-shelf tools and solutions and products. They're obviously grounded in what thought leadership has always been grounded in. But the nature of thought leadership began to shift. You weren't just necessarily trying to prove how smart you were, but you were really trying to draw a much more of a straight line between what you say and what you sell. So that was sort of one inflection point. And I think the second one in parallel with that was the much deeper involvement of marketing and marketers in the world of thought leadership, which had been traditionally kind of like a newsroom media environment. It had kind of been a lot of ex-journalists and ex-business journalists at newspapers and magazines who were seeking to take complex ideas and make them digestible and understandable. But there was a very big divide between sort of the purity of thought leadership and sort of not being seen as a form of marketing. And then when you begin, in terms of the fundamental nature of thought leadership, shifting more towards the provision of services and products and tools and solutions, that balance begins to shift as well. So I sort of feel like we're getting to a point, there's this tension now between the need to more explicitly push users toward what you're selling and the need to, at the same time, retain that real sense of, from the user's perspective, that sense of objectivity that engenders trust, with the readers, that they feel like they are getting impartial advice, they're getting impartial solutions to their problems, and they're not necessarily getting the hard sell. And that balance has shifted a little.
And I think one of the shifts to that I've also seen is a democratization of thought leadership, where it used to be reserved to a small pool of people, either the top of
Yes.
the house or senior execs. And now more people are expected to participate in thought
Mm-hmm.
leadership in some way, whether they're creating it within their expertise, they're helping deploy it. So I've seen more organizations weave the sales team into
Mm-hmm.
the distribution of thought leadership, and certainly marketing and the rise of content marketing over the past couple of decades. There's been a persistent question of, where does content marketing end and thought leadership begin, right?
I agree. Yeah, I agree. I mean, because I think traditionally it was kind of that sort of newspaper, magazine, we report, and then paraphrase Fox News, we report, and then you decide if you want to use this. And
Right.
it was sort of marketing, not by stealth by any stretch. I think everyone knows that thought leadership fundamentally is a form of content marketing, but it was very much, there wasn't a clear line between what you wrote and what you attempted to sell or to market. Now it's definitely shifted, and that has also, I mean, it has implications on a lot of fronts. It has implications on what you say. Part of the mission with thought leadership to me is not only telling users what they want to know, which is responding to their demand around solving problems on their behalf, but often I think it's telling them what they need to know, things they don't know yet, and things that big firms are privy to by virtue of the number of people they have in their organization, by virtue of the number of organizations that you work with. We see things that individual leaders don't see, and so often there's that need, or you feel that compulsion to say, "Hey, you should know about this." But when you can't necessarily tie that directly back to something that you're selling, it becomes, in a world that is becoming a little, where thought leadership is becoming a little more content marketing oriented. Well, that becomes an interesting equation, to try and strike that balance, because there needs to be a balance, I think, for sure.
Well, and that puts tension on the editorial calendar as well,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
So there are the things which, from a journalistic or reporting perspective, as you're noticing trends or patterns that are visible when you have multiple touch points across an industry, but not necessarily if you're in one organization. That's
Yeah.
one function of thought leadership. Another one is to advance the conversation in a way where there are things that people should be talking about or preparing for, but they're
Mm-hmm.
not tied to this quarter or this year. They might be
Yeah.
5, 10 years out,
Yeah.
but the work needs to be done now to prepare for that future, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that also what gets fed into it is the need, or the sense of immediacy and urgency. So thought leadership traditionally, I guess traditional thought leadership, if you want to call it that, has a long shelf life. I remember at McKinsey, you would get the stats around visits to particular pieces of content, and inevitably pieces that were published several years earlier were in the top 10. They were just
Right. Yeah. There's an
there every quarter.
evergreen, if not long
Yeah.
shelf life perspective. Yeah.
Yeah, and the best thought leadership should have that, because it's the best thought leadership happens very rarely. It's a seminal framework, or a particular way of thinking about solving a really thorny problem, and it gets referred back to again and again and again. Yet the market today is also demanding a much shorter shelf life, and so I think we're all trying to strike that balance between offering deeply researched, deeply thought out, rigorous thought leadership that adds tremendous value over a long period of time, and in an ideal world, fundamentally shifts how someone thinks about a certain problem. We're trying to strike the balance between offering that and offering what leaders want tomorrow, because something happened overnight in Europe, and they wake up and they think, boy, I wonder what EY thinks of that. Because we happen to have 300,000 people around the world dealing with thousands of companies, and we have a perspective on what that would mean for an individual within an organization in a particular industry or in a particular region. And so we're all now trying to sort of pedal on two fronts at the same time. On the one hand, you're sort of trying to develop this deeply researched, sort of almost like investigative journalism style content, supplemented by your daily news, and accepting that that daily news may not necessarily be relevant tomorrow.
So let's explore that for a moment through the lens of the year that has been 2020, for
Yeah,
example. If
yeah,
you're looking downstream and you're talking about those things that leaders should be thinking about, and then
hmm,
say you're back in March 2020 as the world is, dealing with the news of COVID, if you're not responding in some way to the things that are top of mind for them at that point, you
yeah,
almost you feel tone deaf, right? So I've seen a lot of
absolutely.
organizations struggle with how do we rebalance our editorial calendar when on one hand there's the black swan urgency, and the other hand you're trying to stay true to your messaging or platform, the things that you're trying to communicate, which have a longer cadence to them. How did you approach that balancing?
I mean, it was really, you would have seen every single professional services firm, everyone engaged in the world of thought leadership, dramatically ramp up content in March, April, and May. We were no exception. And I think part of that was just a scramble. People wanted answers. There were questions that needed answers, but no one really knew what the answer was. No one knew how COVID was developing, how it would necessarily impact organizations. There were dramatic changes underfoot in terms of how people worked, where they worked. So we were all kind of throwing stuff against the wall to see what stuck. And I think that was a direct response to market demand. There was no to sit back and not do anything would have been the worst possible response. I think part of the balancing act we all then had was, when do you pivot?
Right.
You can't look externally as though you're insensitive or as though the pandemic has suddenly disappeared. It obviously hasn't. But in big organizations like turning around an ocean liner, you're not making decisions today that necessarily manifest tomorrow. It takes 6 months, it takes 9 months, it takes a year. So you need your thought leadership to begin reflecting the fact that at some point these organizations are going to need to think about what's happening in the medium to longer term. So we had three lenses we applied. We had sort of a now, next, beyond framework, and we sought to flesh out content in the now. Here's what you need to do today to respond to this very immediate problem that you're dealing with. The next is, when you have the capacity or the mental breathing room, you can think about what you should be doing 3, 6 months down the road. And then beyond is sort of once the pandemic has receded, ideally. But we had a big debate around, when do you pivot? When do you begin shifting the balance of content more toward beyond at the expense of now, without looking as though you are downplaying or being insensitive to what people are dealing with every single day. And so I think that the way we were sort of mentally, we didn't do this any sort of formal way, was sort of thinking about, okay, if at the beginning of the pandemic, we're thinking 80% of the content is now and 20% is next and beyond, in 2 months' time, we'll begin to shift it more towards 40% being next, with maybe 30% either side, now and beyond. I think now we're almost fully in the beyond phase, and we've sought to reposition that content and reposition the way we want organizations to think about it as the opportunity that's now been presented to reframe your future as an organization as a result of what's happened. And so that's the branding we've adopted, is reframe your future, to view what's happened with COVID as, obviously not to diminish the tragedy and the impact that is still ongoing every single day, particularly here in the United States, but to also view it as, from an organizational perspective, a wake-up call and an opportunity to shift your organization in a healthier direction, which feeds into also our broader organizational goals around building a better working world and thinking about long-term value and thinking about more inclusive capitalism, thinking about your organization's purpose, etc. But it was definitely, I mean, I have friends obviously back at McKinsey and at Deloitte and other places, and it was a real sort of all hands on deck effort for about 3 months there. And I don't think the pace has diminished all that much, but I think the clarity that that we've all gained over time is to be able to look beyond the immediate and start thinking more about what organizations should be doing in that sort of longer term horizon. And so that's where we're all now shifted.
So I think that now next beyond framework And we've been talking about frameworks, but this is sort of a meta framework for thought leadership, is one that's very useful. Because the way that I think about thought leadership is you go and you peer around the corner into the future. You're
Yeah.
looking for what's going to be important to know. You're doing sense making, and then you're bringing those insights back to people today and telling them, here are the steps that you need to be taking, right? And
Yeah.
so when you're looking around the corner, if you're using a now, next, beyond, the next is immediately around the corner, the beyond is further down, and then you
Yeah.
have to bring it back to the next. Otherwise, just because you've seen the future, if you can't help people prepare for it, you haven't done your role in thought
No, I
leadership.
agree. No, I agree. And I think it was a really useful framework as a forcing mechanism. I think it allowed us as an organization to, we're a huge firm.
Right.
There is thought leadership being developed all over the world, in every region, in every service line, every sector. COVID gave us visibility that I don't think we'd previously had. Just the sheer volume of content that was flowing through. So it was useful to give in a visibility sense, and then that allowed us to put the framework around it to give it some structure. Because if you're disorganized, I guess I'm full of cliches, but I always think you are what you publish, or you are what you communicate to the outside world. As an external user, your impression of a firm is outside in is what you know on their website or what you see in the marketing material. And in that sort of, it's not helpful as a user to just be confronted by 1,000 pieces of content on every conceivable topic if that's not advancing your goals as an organization. And I think the Now Next Beyond framework and Now Reframe Your Future allows us as an organization to much more clearly articulate who we are and what we're about in terms of our thought leadership. I think we've had a very strong brand generally, and people have a very firm impression and a developed impression of who EY is. But I think our thought leadership is now becoming more reflective thanks to the efforts of a ton of people across the organization, particularly in brand marketing communications. The thought leadership is now being much more reflective of who we see ourselves as an organization and how we want people to perceive us.
If you are enjoying this episode of Leveraging Thought Leadership, please make sure to subscribe. If you'd like to help spread the word about the podcast, please leave a 5-star review and share it with your friends. We are available on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and all major platforms, as well as at leveragingthoughtleadership.com. So I want to ask a question about modalities and
Mm-hmm.
shifts possibly in modalities. So the classic big consulting house thought leadership was the magazine, the white paper, the research report. But now we
Yeah.
have a ton of short form modalities, whether
Mm-hmm.
it's a LinkedIn post, a tweet, etc. How has EY responded and adapted to the consumption of content? Because reaching audiences is important, and people are not reading as much long form anymore. They still do,
Yeah.
but not as much.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a work in progress for everyone, not just us. I think the general consensus is you want people to read the right content in the right place at the right time, wherever they happen to want it and in whatever format they want it. So we are pushing hard on format innovation, and not for the sake of just being different, but to try and figure out exactly, if you are an individual sitting in a particular role, let's say you're a CFO, and within the marketing funnel, so to speak, you're at the awareness phase or the consideration phase, where it happens to be, how are we specifically speaking to you as an individual at that point in your thought process, and are we delivering the content that is necessary to help push you to the next step? And in some ways, as a old journalist, that is kind of a very kind of technical, almost a little bit sort of, harsh isn't the right word, but it's a very rigid way of approaching thought leadership, because we tend to think of thought leadership more as people are doing work out in the field. They worked with a number of clients on a particular issue. They come back with really interesting insights around how they manage to help these organizations improve, and there you write the thought leadership, and it helps people, and it's a lot less direct and precise than it might be in a traditional content marketing world. Like, that's where I get to the point about the sort of the world's merging a little bit and finding that balance between delivering content that is still reflective of what the users are demanding, what clients, potential clients want, and ensuring that it balances and matches up with what our needs are as an organization. I struggle sometimes personally with the idea that I don't like trying to tell users that they should find something interesting and important because we find it interesting and important. Because ultimately
Right.
we work for them. At the same time, this gets back to the what you need to know and what you want to know. Their needs in the immediate term, or what they want an answer to today, we should be responding to, but we also have a perspective around what we think they should know about and be responding to over a medium to longer term, or even a short term, they just haven't noticed it yet. So there's definitely that balancing act, and the format innovation is critical, because I think in a lot of cases, it's not necessarily around inventing new content or commissioning content or creating new content. In some ways, it's just being more responsive in terms of taking your existing content and busting it up or atomizing it, whatever you want to describe it, into just more bite-sized chunks across different formats and different channels.
And then if someone sees one of those snackable bites and says, "Oh, that's interesting," then you can leave breadcrumbs to point them back to the larger form
Sure,
materials.
and I'm shameless. I sort of say I am completely format and platform agnostic. I just want
You
people
have
to
to
see
be.
the content.
Yeah.
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 I just want people to see it. I want them to get some value out of it, irrespective of how little or how much time they spend with it. I want them to get something from it. If that results in them coming back and saying, really want to work with you guys and I want to spend a truckload of money, that's fantastic. If it results in them getting a useful nugget that helps them solve a particular problem, or even think about something differently just in the moment, I'll take that as well, But I think you're right. We're driven by the market. People don't necessarily want to sit down and read a 20-minute, 4,000 word think piece, when what they really want is, give me three. We all sort of fall into the glossy magazine approach. Give me three things I can use to think about this particular issue today.
Well, and there's a tension between the listicle of the here's three quick takeaways you can do versus a think piece, right? And a lot of people who are deep subject matter experts want to write the long form, but there's the challenge of how do you take those insights and package it in a way that the reader is actually going to consume? Because it doesn't matter if it's the most brilliant research report ever if nobody's touching it. Right.
I agree, and you face that constant battle particularly with senior, extremely smart, successful senior people who say, "I don't want you dumbing me down." So this isn't dumbing you down. This is
because
making
it's
your content
they perceive it as their brand, right, and their reputation. Yeah,
we're making your content accessible. We are. I mean, I always say, I want to make you look smart. I want you to look brilliant, but as you say, there's no point being a genius sitting in the basement and no one ever sees your work or reads your work or understands what you're saying. And I think that's where some of the journalistic sensibilities come in as well. I think we've moved toward pretty heavily trying to eliminate the more academic style of thought leadership in favor of a more news-oriented or inverted pyramid style, like you might find in a newsroom. The assumption
don't bury the lead.
Yeah, work on the assumption that the three most important elements, and I say facetiously, spend more time on this than the rest of the article: the title, the deck, or the blurb, or the teaser text, whatever you want to describe it, and the intro. I'm like, that 20 seconds is the most critical. That is nothing more important than those 20 seconds. You lose someone at that point, you're not going to get them back. And so front load it with what's the news point of this? Think about it, how a journalist would receive a press release and go, what am I going to write on this? Front load the insights. And then you can absolutely go into chapter and verse about the history and client examples and all of the stuff that really brings it to life and adds color and depth and really shows and fully demonstrates your expertise and your intelligence. But if you don't get them at the beginning, all of that's just irrelevant.
Thought leadership, especially in the current environment over the last few years, and I think going forward, has to be punchy. You can't write the long expository text that goes almost in a Socratic method that the big ahas at the end. Nobody's going to get there.
No, and particularly not going to get there when, let's be honest, there was so much thought leadership. It's commoditized to the point of almost irrelevance. And so I think we are certainly focusing on editorial strategy is built around quality over quantity. We really want to be more rigorous and ruthless about what we decide to publish on. And that's not an issue of resources on our side. That's an issue of sort of consideration for the end user. That's, if we have, I saw whether it was correct or not, I'm not sure. I think a HBR piece a while back talking about the percentage of time in the average executive's day when they actually have the capacity to think about thought leadership or to read thought leadership. And it was minuscule. And so you begin thinking, all right, how do you grab someone who has potentially 3 minutes in a day? How do you grab their attention? How do you cut through the noise and try and become part of the conversation for them, or begin having them think differently about what your firm offers as a thought partner or as a thought leader? And yeah, you're right. I mean, you can't have the, here's 1,000 words of background on this topic, and here's 2,000 words with our, explaining the methodology behind how we did this, and here's another 1,000 words on something else, and finally at the 5,000 word mark, we'll get to something insightful. You can't do that. And I'm not sure you should ever have done that, but I think you had the ability maybe to do that previously, but you certainly don't anymore.
So one of the things that I have heard repeatedly from senior leadership is they wish they had more time to read and consume information, to do
We all
the
do.
environmental scan either
Yeah.
horizontally or go deep on a topic, but
Yeah.
pulled from meeting to meeting, conversation, decision to decision, and
Yeah.
not having that chance. And so you've got to meet them with the reality of where they are for content rather than where you wish they would be. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Which gets to that seeking to, as opposed to trying to convince them that what you think is important, accepting that what they think is important is what's important. And, in that respect, I think I think we can learn a lot from a marketing approach towards thought leadership, and sort of a content marketing approach, and sort of almost a branded content approach. And we can learn a lot from traditional media and traditional news gathering and news reporting. And there's a balance between the two. So I think that, yeah, you're absolutely right. We need to grasp the 10 seconds that we have. And that might be a tweet. That might be an email with an exhibit embedded that tells the whole story without any text or anything additional. It might be a interesting counterintuitive data point, but something that provides the entry point into your thinking, so that you can grab the reader and make them understand we've got something really valuable for you here, something that could provide competitive differentiation, or something that just you should know about.
So how did you fall into the world of thought leadership? I'm assuming, like many, you didn't go to school for it, and I know you've mentioned the journalism background. So how did you get here?
I think falling into it's probably the right word. Yeah, I don't think does anyone grow up and think I really want to be a thought leadership practitioner when I'm older?
Right, right.
It's not.
I certainly
It's not as sexy as a fireman or a policeman or something. No, so I was a journalist. I'm Australian. I was a newspaper journalist in Australia. I came to the US almost 20 years ago as a foreign correspondent in New York. Didn't want to go back to Australia, and I got my green card, went to work at Bloomberg, and was sort of not that enamored with what I was doing. And I thought I would try a career switch. So I ended up joining McKinsey in New York, actually as a consultant. And I always say, as a consultant, I made a really good journalist. I was not a particularly great consultant. So I was at a loose end again after a couple of years of being a consultant at McKinsey, and the opportunity came up to switch across to what was then really to the McKinsey Quarterly as an editor. And I ended up working there through various roles, and then eventually joining the McKinsey Publishing Group. And then in the final few years at McKinsey, I was day to day overseeing the content flowing to McKinsey.com. But it was interesting because this gets a little bit to the shifting nature of the industry as well. Certainly at that point, the publishing group at McKinsey was comprised almost exclusively of former business journalists. It was newspaper journalists, magazine journalists, head of publishing came from a big business magazine, and there was that real journalistic sensibility. Since I've left McKinsey, I've been at Deloitte, where I oversaw thought leadership, and now I oversee thought. I'm the global editor in chief at EY. There's a lot more people with diverse backgrounds, people from marketing backgrounds, as well as people from traditional journalism backgrounds. So it's definitely, the balance is shifting a little bit. But yeah, no, I did very much fell into it. I would never have conceived that I would, especially as a journalist, when you spend your whole life essentially trying to tweak companies and get under their skin, to now be on the other side was kind of interesting. But yeah, I've been doing this now for a long time.
And as you said, you're global editor in chief at EY. That means you've got teams underneath you that are looking for stories, editing, writing. You're working with individuals. How are you helping them get their mindset into a thought leadership framework rather than either a journalistic framework or that content marketing and sales? So, what are you doing coaching, leading, setting vision?
So, it's not quite as structured as that. I mean, I work across the organization with the service line sectors, with particularly with the brand marketing communications team. I sit within the global markets team, and it's sort of an influence model more than anything else. We are pushing on, again, advancing the quality over quantity strategy, pushing on helping people see the value in adopting more of a newsroom mentality. But we have really smart, capable people embedded throughout the organization, throughout service line sectors, throughout regions, who work collaboratively with our frontline folks around thinking through their thought leadership priorities and what they should be publishing on. And then we are, seeking to work with them cooperatively around shaping that content, helping them think through positioning and narrative. Sort of, we live in a world of increasing specialization, and I think it's nice to think that you have people working on content who are subject matter experts and really really get it and who have the nitty gritty. I'm not sure any editor slash writer necessarily has subject matter expertise. I think they have subject matter familiarity. I think the subject matter expertise we bring is helping people understand what works for an external audience, helping them think through how to tell a story in a compelling way, how to pull people in that first 20 seconds, how to add color and depth, and think through formats and channels and how it's presented on the website from a user journey perspective. All of that stuff that is that in the absence of that, you can have the strongest distinctive insight at the core of what you're doing, but if you don't have all those other pieces, it just doesn't break through. So, we are working every day, helping people think through their positioning, helping them think through their narrative, working through drafts. A lot of it's cajoling and sort of nudging and prodding and influencing. But, at the end of the day, it's not our content. The content belongs to the authors, and so they have to be happy with what gets published. And so we're working collaboratively and together to try and figure out how we tell the story in the most effective way.
Well, and I think you hit on one of the things that for me is absolutely essential for thought leadership, that it has to be storytelling designed to get your audience to lean in and go, that's interesting. Tell
Yeah,
me more.
yeah,
If you haven't done good storytelling and you've just written dry text, you will not get traction for the idea. There are academic libraries filled with great ideas, research dissertations, etc., that have never seen commercial utilization
yeah.
because there was no story.
No, and I see that every day. You read some schlocky novel and you think I could have written this, but the story, you can't put it down.
Right. It's 2 in the morning
And
and you're still reading.
like I was on when we still were flying. I remember I was reading the new, at that point, relatively new Dan Brown book and I kind of ashamed that I read him. I was on the plane, and when I literally didn't put my phone down the whole. I read the whole book on the flight. And when I stood up, the guy behind me was like, "That must have been some book." And I was like, it was really poorly written, but my goodness, it told a good story. So yeah, I mean, I agree with you, and I think that the convergence of thought leadership, the way it's evolved from being a slightly more academic, dry, esoteric form of content to now moving really into that sort of consumer engaging, branded storytelling, I think is really interesting. I think it's exciting. I love the idea that we begin adopting some sort of narrative techniques from the world of branded content or from content marketing as a mechanism for hooking people to, again, not because you're overtly trying to sell them something, but because they begin to associate your brand with a particular kind of storytelling that resonates with them, or they feel as though, and from our perspective, I might argue, all of our content should be reflective of the notion of building a better working world. When you come to EY content, it is infused with the sense that at the end of the day, we are all pushing towards a world of greater equality, of greater quality of opportunity, of more socially aware organizations who prioritize long-term value and have purpose, etc. I would love to get to that point where I feel as though our content connects with users at a sort of a visceral level like that. Sounds a bit highfalutin, but I think that's what we're all fundamentally aiming for, because you just can't expect someone to wade through a 4,000 word academic piece of content, and A, you can't expect them to do it, and B, I don't think they're going to walk away with the kind of tangible, usable advice that they might get from a really sharply written, compelling, engaging 800-word piece, or a video, or a podcast,
Yep.
or an interactive, or an
Sometimes you can
infographic,
do
or
something
whatever.
in 90 seconds in a short
Yep.
form video rather
Yep.
than 50 pages, right? And so it's finding the modality to deliver the idea in a way that someone can digest and go, oh, right, I see what I need to do next. And that call to action may be more reading or more learning for them, or maybe
Yep.
something they can implement immediately, right?
And it can be hard to change the mindset too. I mean, I'm a former journalist. I come from that world. I love the written word. I still fundamentally believe that the most effective, generally speaking, form of communication for thought leadership is the written word, partly because most of our users are at work. They don't necessarily want to be sitting at their desk watching a video or whatever happens to be. Not that anyone's at a desk
Somehow
in
it's
an
seen
office
as less
anymore.
serious, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
But you have to. But I fully recognize one of my inbuilt prejudices. I need to be accepting of the fact that, you know what, maybe a 90-second video shot with an iPhone, not
Mm-hmm.
particularly super well produced, can be as effective, if not more effective, than a 2,000-word article. Absolutely. If you tell it the right way, if you hit the person at the right time with the right content.
Yep. And that humility to step outside the modalities that you're comfortable with
Yeah.
and deliver it in the needs of your audience is absolutely essential. Luke, your passion for creating, curating, and deploying thought leadership is really unmistakable. Thank you for joining me today and sharing your insights on some tricky editorial decisions in thought leadership, such as the content mix, the modality, and finding the right voice. This has been great. Thank you. If you've enjoyed this episode, please join our LinkedIn group, Organizational Thought Leadership. It's a professional community where thought leadership practitioners talk shop about our field. So if you're someone who creates, curates, or deploys thought leadership for your organization, then please join the conversation in the Organizational Thought Leadership LinkedIn